The temperature of the online conversation suggests something deeper is happening here. While everyone was focused on whether Caitlin Clark might leave Indiana, her agent Erin Kane was playing an entirely different game. She wasn't just managing a frustrated rookie, she was building a case that could rewrite the WNBA's rulebook forever. What you're about to hear isn't coming from press conferences or official statements. This is connecting the dots from digital breadcrumbs, filtering through the noise of speculation to find the signals that point to something much bigger than one player's contract situation. I'm Jackson Riley, and I've been following the meta-narratives in WNBA culture, the stories behind the stories that drive real change. And what I've discovered about Kane's strategy over the past months isn't just impressive, it's revolutionary. She took every piece of coaching drama, every injury mismanagement, every moment of Clark's visible frustration, and weaponized it into ammunition for collective bargaining negotiations that could transform how every future star is treated in this league. So let me set the stage for you. The WNBA Players Association opted out of their collective bargaining agreement, setting up negotiations that will determine the league's future through 2030 and beyond. The October 31, 2025 deadline isn't just about salary increases. It's about fundamental structural changes to how players are protected, developed, and empowered within organizations. But here's what the mainstream coverage missed. Erin Kane didn't wait for those negotiations to begin. She started building her case the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto an Indiana Fever practice court. Every coaching decision, every injury, every public comment from Clark about the team's limitations, Kane was documenting it all as evidence of systemic failures that needed to be addressed in the new CBA. Think about the timeline. Clark suffers her first groin injury in early June. Instead of keeping it quiet, Kane allows details to emerge about how the coaching staff initially downplayed the severity. Then comes the quad injury later in the season. Again, questions surface about whether proper protocols were followed, whether the training staff was adequately protecting their most valuable asset. Official sources won't tell you this, but if you follow the digital breadcrumbs, a different picture emerges. Kane wasn't just concerned about Clark's health. She was creating a documented pattern of organizational negligence that could be used as leverage in CBA discussions about medical care standards, injury prevention protocols, and player advocacy rights. The coaching drama with Stephanie White provided even more ammunition. When Clark publicly stated, "We need to do a better job getting the ball in transition," it wasn't just frustration. It was evidence of a player being stifled by coaching systems that prioritized control over talent development. Kane could point to this as proof that current CBA language about player input and tactical decisions was insufficient. But the masterstroke was how Kane handled the media narrative around these issues. Instead of trying to suppress negative coverage, she let it build. Every article about Clark's injuries, every analysis piece questioning White's coaching decisions, every social media discussion about whether Indiana was mismanaging their franchise player, it all became part of a broader case about why the WNBA needed stronger player protection mechanisms. I've been filtering through the noise, and the signals point to Kane using Clark's situation as a test case for league-wide policy changes. She's not just representing one player, she's pioneering new standards for how agents can advocate for their clients within existing power structures. The Turnell photo at Barclays Center that everyone interpreted as tampering or recruitment, that was Kane demonstrating something entirely different. She was showing that her client had options, that other organizations recognized Clark's value in ways Indiana didn't. But more importantly, she was creating visual evidence of the kind of respect and professional treatment that should be standard across the league. Now let's talk about what this actually achieved. The new CBA negotiations include unprecedented language about injury management protocols, There are proposed standards for medical staff qualifications, mandatory second opinions for significant injuries, and player rights regarding treatment decisions. These weren't randomly developed policies. They're direct responses to documented issues that emerged during Clark's rookie season. Player input on coaching decisions is another area where Kane's documentation campaign paid off. The new CBA discussions include provisions for player feedback mechanisms, tactical consultation requirements, and restrictions on coaching systems that fundamentally contradict a player's established skill set. Again, these aren't abstract concepts. They're solutions to specific problems that Kane methodically highlighted through Clark's experience. But the story doesn't end there. Kane's approach created a template that other agents are now following. The documentation of organizational failures, the strategic use of media coverage, the positioning of individual player issues as league-wide systemic problems. It's becoming the new standard for high-level player representation. Okay, now let's get into rumor territory. Nothing is officially confirmed, but the online chatter is too loud to ignore. Sources close to the negotiations suggest that Kane's Clark documentation became required reading for CBA committee members. Her systematic breakdown of how current league structures failed to protect and develop their most marketable player reportedly influenced multiple policy proposals. The genius of Kane's strategy wasn't just in identifying problems, it was in framing those problems as opportunities for league growth. Clark's injuries weren't just medical issues, they were risks to the WNBA's most valuable marketing asset. The coaching drama weren't just personality clashes, they were examples of how outdated systems could stifle the kind of exciting play that drives viewership and revenue. This is where Kane separated herself from traditional sports representation. She wasn't just protecting her clients' interests, she was positioning those interests as aligned with the league's long-term success. When she documented Indiana's failures, she wasn't attacking the organization, she was demonstrating why stronger standards would benefit everyone. The CBA negotiations that concluded earlier this year included language that would have been unthinkable without Kane's groundwork. Medical care standards, player development protocols, input mechanisms for tactical decisions. These weren't abstract policy discussions. They were concrete responses to documented failures in how the league's biggest star was handled during her rookie season. So what's fact and what's speculation? Let's break it down. The fact is that Erin Kane methodically documented every aspect of Clark's treatment by the Indiana Fever organization. The fact is that these documented issues closely align with policy areas that received unprecedented attention in CBA negotiations. The speculation is whether this coordination was intentional or coincidental. But here's what makes this story even more significant. The ripple effects are already visible across the league. Other agents are adopting Kane's documentation approach. Young players are being advised to more carefully track their treatment by organizations. The power dynamic between individual players and team management has shifted in ways that go far beyond Clark's specific situation. The temperature of the online conversation suggests that Kane's influence on the new CBA extends beyond the policies that made it into the final agreement. Her approach to advocacy, public, documented, systematic, has become a new model for how player representation can function in professional sports. She didn't just solve problems for one client, she changed how problems get identified and addressed league-wide. Reading the signals from league executives, there's clear recognition that the Kane model represents a new era of player advocacy. Organizations can no longer assume that individual player issues will remain isolated or private. The expectation now is that any systematic failure in player treatment will be documented, publicized, and used as leverage for broader policy changes. This brings us to the inevitable question: what happens next? Kane has established a new standard for player representation that goes far beyond traditional contract negotiations. She's shown how individual player experiences can be leveraged into league-wide policy changes. The coaching drama that seemed like typical rookie adjustment issues was actually the foundation for systematic changes in how the WNBA governs player-coach relationships. Clark's public comments about tactical limitations weren't just frustration, they were evidence in a case for player input rights that are now written into league policy. Kane's masterstroke was recognizing that the CBA negotiation window created an opportunity to transform individual grievances into collective benefits. She didn't just advocate for Clark, she advocated for a new framework that would protect every future player who found themselves in similar situations. Official sources won't tell you this, but if you follow the digital breadcrumbs, a different picture emerges. Kane's documentation of Clark's rookie experience became the template for identifying and addressing systemic issues across the league. Her approach to public advocacy created new expectations for how player representation should function in professional sports. The injury management protocols, the coaching input mechanisms, the player development standards, these weren't random policy improvements. They were systematic responses to systematic documentation of systematic failures. Kane turned Clark's individual challenges into collective solutions. But the most important aspect of Kane's strategy was how she framed everything as league improvement rather than organizational criticism. She didn't attack Indiana's management, she identified opportunities for better standards that would benefit everyone. This approach made her arguments harder to dismiss and easier to implement as official policy. The new CBA includes language that essentially codifies Kane's approach to player advocacy. There are mechanisms for documenting organizational issues, processes for escalating systematic problems, and protections for players who publicly discuss treatment concerns. These weren't theoretical concepts, they were direct responses to how Kane handled Clark's situation. What we're seeing now is other agents attempting to replicate Kane's systematic approach. But here's the key difference. Kane wasn't just documenting problems, she was building a case for specific solutions during a specific negotiation window. The timing, the strategy, the execution, it all aligned to create maximum leverage at the exact moment when policy changes were possible. So as we look ahead to future CBA negotiations, the question isn't whether other agents will try to use Kane's playbook, they already are. The question is whether they'll be as strategic about timing, as systematic about documentation, and as effective at framing individual issues as collective opportunities. The temperature of the online conversation suggests that Kane's influence extends far beyond the specific policies that changed. She's created new expectations for how player advocacy should function, new standards for how individual issues can be leveraged into collective benefits, and new models for how agents can influence league-wide policy through strategic documentation and public advocacy. Kane's coaching drama wasn't just rookie adjustment issues, it was the foundation for systematic changes in player-coach relationship governance that will affect every future WNBA player. Kane took individual frustrations and transformed them into collective protections. The injury management controversies weren't just medical care concerns. They were evidence in a case for league-wide protocol improvements that are now written into official policy. Kane took individual health issues and transformed them into systematic prevention standards. The tactical limitation complaints weren't just player frustration, they were documentation of coaching system failures that led to player input requirements now codified in league governance. Kane took individual concerns and transformed them into collective rights. This is how one agent used public dysfunction to change rules for an entire sport. Not through backroom negotiations or private complaints, but through systematic documentation of systematic failures during a strategic window when systematic solutions were possible. Reading the signals from current league operations, Kane's influence is visible in how organizations now handle player concerns. There's increased attention to documentation, more careful consideration of public statements, and greater awareness that individual issues can become collective policy discussions. The coaching staff protocols, the medical care standards, the player input mechanisms, these represent a fundamental shift in how the WNBA governs player-organization relationships. And they exist because one agent recognized that individual documentation could become collective transformation. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Kane didn't just change policies, she changed expectations. Future players will expect the kind of systematic advocacy that Kane provided for Clark. Future agents will be measured against the standard she established. Future CBA negotiations will assume the kind of documentation and public strategy that she pioneered. So what's the real lesson here? It's that individual player experiences, when systematically documented and strategically leveraged during appropriate timing windows, can become the foundation for league-wide policy improvements. Kane didn't just solve problems for one client, she created solutions for everyone. The next time you see coaching drama or injury management controversies or player frustration with organizational treatment, remember that these might not be isolated issues. They might be documented evidence in a case for systematic change that's being built for the next opportunity to transform league policy. Erin Kane took Caitlin Clark's coaching drama and used it to change WNBA rules forever. She turned individual challenges into collective solutions, personal frustrations into policy improvements, and temporary problems into permanent protections. That's the power of systematic advocacy during strategic windows. That's how one agent transformed not just her client situation, but the entire framework for how player-organization relationships function in professional women's basketball. The rules changed forever because Kane recognized that forever was possible and she had the documentation to make it happen. What do you think about Kane's strategy? Was this calculated brilliance or fortunate timing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this breakdown opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're always connecting the dots on the stories behind the stories that really drive change in WNBA culture. Share this with anyone who needs to understand how individual advocacy can become collective transformation, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into the meta-narratives that shape the league we love.